hear anything to the contrary, we'll assume it's going ahead and of course make mention. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yeah. It'd be nice to think that it would be cancelled because it's over 500, but had a meeting yesterday, and one of our guys who's a jazz musician said with that oh yeah, that won't be a problem with jazz musicians.
seriously compromised in this area, and to keep a fashion supply chain clean is almost impossible these days. And fair trade works very, very hard to try to ensure. You have a fantastic company in New Zealand called Kowtow that's doing fair trade supply chains, which means that they're not only using fair trade cotton from fair trade producers, but their whole supply chain is transparent to the world and ensures that there's no modern slavery. And we find, fair trade is so thoroughly audited around the world. We work in, we have producers in 75 countries. We have markets where we're selling goods in 125 countries. And we find things in supply chains. I mean, make no mistake, there are things in supply chains. And when we find them, the difference is we have a very clear structure to deal with that breach and to get that particular player out of the supply chain. And that's the real direction that the economy's got to go, so that people can really trust what they're doing. But unfortunately, in the world today, everybody wants everything cheap. And so people will do very, very shoddy things to sort of tick a box and say, oh, yes, we're good. We're basking in the glow of being good corporate citizens. But actually, very rarely is it, and in the case of fair trade, if it's not fair trade, it's actually really difficult to demonstrate and prove what its impact is.
So who bears responsibility, finally, for this, Molly? Government? Is it companies that turn the blind eye, or consumers who demand, really, will vote with their dollars for lower prices?
Well, it's all of us. I mean, the reality is that the pickle we're in right now is because, there's a good portion of us that actually really pay attention to either, buying, recycled clothing, or being thoughtful about what we do, making sure that we understand what our impact on the world is. There's a wonderful and amazingly innovative group, and particularly they are in the millennials and the younger generations coming up, that really do understand there are serious consequences to their choices on those things. But there are then a lot of us, and there are many companies that are doing amazing things. I mean, there are many companies whose chief executives and whose whole organizations do really understand what's going on. And, Ben & Jerry's would be one of those. They're part of Unilever, which has taken a very serious approach to these sorts of things. So big and small, there are those doing their bit. But and governments, there are some governments that are stronger. The New Zealand government has actually only last year had a fantastic initiative looking at trade for all and trying to understand what is the impact of trade on New Zealanders and New Zealanders' impact of trade on the world, really. And to be forethoughtful in thinking about that as a New Zealand national assessment was actually really quite an innovative thing. It's the first one I'm aware of. So, there are really strong areas where action is taken that is trying to create accountable structures. And then there is the large mass of people for whom it's very difficult, and they just find it too much to deal with, or that the information is just not clear enough. There are governments that are doing a great job, and then there are some that are not taking their job seriously. I mean, I reckon Australia has probably delayed climate change action by nearly 20 years because of the way they have dealt the last couple of decades with the climate change issue, and allowing countries like the U.S. to get away with what they've gotten away with. So there's ways that we can influence positively, and there's ways that we can influence negatively. I guess for all of us, in a time of some concern and with this kind of a health crisis on, it's a really nice time to reflect. What am I doing, and what kind of a difference am I making, and how could I have a more positive impact on the world, and sort of know for sure what my impact is. And that's a reflection that all of us can have in our jobs, if we're running companies, if we're running government departments, or if we're just individuals. We can definitely look at that. And as I would say, there are solutions to these problems. We just have to get a critical mass acting in that way, and creating products in that way for us to tip the balance. But we've got a bit of a hard road yet ahead.
Sorry you missed out on your New Zealand trip. We hope to welcome you back again at some stage in the near future. Molly Harris-Olsen, CEO of Fair Trade for Australia and New Zealand, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, Jesse, and thanks for having me. And I'll look forward to, I'm in New Zealand a lot because half of my team are there, so I'll look forward to being able to get across as soon as these bans are lifted.
Lovely. Nice to chat to you. We've got time for a track from the new Mansfield album. This was a compilation, or is a compilation, reimagining the poetry of Catherine Mansfield. And, well, they did recently announce that they'll be doing a live version of the album. Hard to imagine that will go ahead, but at the moment planned for Bruce Mason Centre and the Opera House in June. So this album features Julia Deans and Lawrence Arabia and French for Rabbits. I'm going to play you a Mel Parsons track now. She's a good friend of the show here. And this is her performing the Catherine Mansfield poem, There Was a Child Once.
There was a child once. He came to play in my garden. He was quite pale and silent, and only when he smiled I knew everything about him. I knew what he had in his pockets, and I knew the feel of his hands in my hands, the most intimate tones of his voice. I led him down each secret path, showing him the hiding place of all my treasures. I let him play with them, every one. I put my singing thoughts in a little silver cage and gave them to him to keep. It was very dark in the garden, but never dark enough for us. On tiptoe we walked among the deepest shades. We bathed in the shadow pools beneath the trees, pretending we were under the sea. Once near the boundary of the...
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Ministry of Health for today's media update. So New Zealand has 3 new cases of COVID-19. We have 2 in a Wellington family recently returned from the United States, and the 3rd in a Dunedin man recently returned from Germany. So all these cases are associated with overseas travel. The Wellington man in his 30s and his father in his 70s tested positive on their return from the USA, as I say. The man in his 30s became unwell on the flight, and his father became unwell the day after they arrived in New Zealand. Neither of these men require hospital care and are both recovering at home. They travelled on American Airlines flight AA83 from Los Angeles to Auckland, arriving in on Saturday the 14th of March. The relevant seats they were in on that flight are seats 4A and 10H. They then travelled to Wellington on Air New Zealand flight NZ419 that same day, and they were in seat numbers 1B and 1C. Now, contact tracing on flights covers now the 2 seats in all directions, to the front, to the back, to the side, and diagonally if relevant. This is supported by current evidence and is in line with the approach taken by the European Centres for Disease Prevention and Control. So the Public Health Unit and Healthline have been contacting those close contacts on those flights. I have given the seat numbers, and they will be in the media release. So they have either contacted or are in the process of contacting people who are in the areas around those seats. If you haven't heard and you are wondering if you are a close contact, then you are welcome to call Healthline. Others on the flight sitting much more distant from those seats, and in particular on the international flight, the 2 seats are in business class and premium economy, so people in economy class are merely considered casual contacts, as are others on the Air New Zealand flight who were seated away from the front row. There is no need for those casual contacts to call Healthline. The information about symptoms of COVID-19 to look out for are available on our website. However, you will expect a call from Healthline just to check that you are aware of that information at some point. So the third case I'm talking about today of the Dunedin man in his 40s, recently returned from Germany, was confirmed just this morning. It was 5 days after the man returned to New Zealand when he began to show symptoms. So contact tracing is not required for people on the flights that he was on. He had been in New Zealand for longer than 72 hours before he developed symptoms. Now, 2 family members who have symptoms are currently being tested and are in self-isolation. The man himself has mild flu-like symptoms and is also at home in self-isolation. One of the 2 family members with symptoms who is currently being tested is a student at Logan Park High School in Dunedin. The student is now in self-isolation at home, as I said. The school is working with both education staff and public health officials. Obviously, we are all very interested to see the outcome of that test because the action that the school takes next will depend on the outcome. Our advice to the school is that if the test result is positive, the school is closed for the next 48 hours while close contacts are traced and put into self-isolation, and all casual contacts, staff and students, are given information about what to do if they become unwell. The school would be carefully cleaned before reopening. This is the approach that has been taken in other jurisdictions, in particular Australia. So, as I've said in the past, we are expecting more sporadic cases of COVID-19. These cases, all our cases to date, are associated with international travel. And as over the last 2 weeks we have seen a big increase in the number of countries overseas with cases, we will expect more travellers returning to New Zealand to present with symptoms of COVID-19, and they will be tested. As you know, since midnight Sunday, all people travelling to New Zealand are required to go into 14 days of self-isolation. So that will be very helpful in us managing any potential onward transmission of any people who have travelled from overseas and who may have COVID-19, and therefore presenting further community spread. At the WHO media briefing overnight, the WHO Director General Tedros reinforced that all countries must take a comprehensive approach, and he describes the most effective way to prevent infections and save lives is by breaking the chains of transmission by testing and isolating. And this, of course, is exactly what New Zealand is doing at the moment. As he says, if they test positive, isolate them, find out who they have been in close contact with, up to 2 days before they develop symptoms, and test those people too if they become symptomatic. New Zealand has no barrier from cost to testing, including there being no cost to individuals for the test itself, nor is there a constraint on capacity, as you've heard the Prime Minister say earlier. However, we also need to ensure that the right people are tested. That is to say, people with a history of recent overseas travel or of contact with a probable, possible or suspected case, and who have symptoms suggestive of COVID-19. Our microbiology laboratory network met yesterday by teleconference, convened by the Ministry's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Andrew Simpson, to ensure that our labs are taking a national and coordinated approach to underpin and support our overall response. Now, both Healthline and the government call centre faced extreme pressure yesterday, with 7 times the usual number of calls from the same time last year. They answered more than 7,000 calls. That's the number they answered. But we have a graph that shows the huge spike in demand yesterday, with over 24,000 people trying to contact Healthline. I know that some people yesterday had to wait some time or their calls got dropped, and that is why. What I can do is that reassure people that Healthline and the staff there are doing an excellent job of trying to answer all calls and to prioritise calls that where people require clinical advice. They've moved all the calls from people just requiring information to the government call centre, and there is now an online process for registering for self-isolation. Around 3,000 of the calls that came to Healthline were able to be referred yesterday to the government helpline. They have increased the phone capacity from 400 parallel lines, and that is going to increase to 1,200 by the end of the week. They've also brought in another 50 nurses with additional clinical support from DHBs in primary care, and another 200 non-clinical staff have been trained to help with Healthline. So the staff there are doing a fantastic job answering a huge number of calls, and there is a graph, as I say, on the Ministry's website showing just what has happened in the first 3 months of this year compared with last year. And I just want to thank the Healthline staff for the advice they are giving and support to thousands of New Zealanders every day. And finally, just around testing, as at 8 a.m. this morning, across the laboratories in Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin and the ESR laboratory here in Wellington, there were 11 confirmed tests. We have the 2 probable cases where the tests were negative and another 570 negative tests. There is a large number of tests underway today. As I've said, we want people to be tested to either rule in or rule out COVID-19, and around the country I would say there are over 500 tests being conducted today. So we're seeing that testing increase. Just to reiterate, we want to test the right people, and the case definition is very clear, and all our practitioners have that. They also have the ability to exercise their clinical judgment if they have concerns. I'm happy to leave my comments there and open to questions.
The health sector got a slither of what went to business support today. Is $500 million enough to carry the health sector through COVID-19?
Yes, I'm very pleased with the 500 million. That is a significant slither. And the Minister in his press release has outlined the various areas of the system that will fund, and not all of it is committed. So there's a significant portion that is there as a contingency as well to help support our overall response. So yes, I'm very pleased with that package, that we've been able to get that signed off so quickly.
I hear from Wellington. Where are they at the moment?
They're at home in self-isolation,
and
yes.
What was their pattern of travel from when they arrived to being at home?
Yes, very limited actually. They have had no close contact other than with a close family member who's also in self-isolation, but no other contact with others who are considered as close contacts. There are just the people who were on the flights with them.
So they were picked up from the airport?
They were picked up by private vehicle at the airport and spent the weekend at home and then were tested. And I should also say that they called ahead to the emergency department so that the emergency department staff were able to wear appropriate PPE and not put themselves at risk. So again, a great example of people following the advice, and that really just does reduce the risk not only to health staff but to other New Zealanders.
Are you going to start testing people that don't show symptoms? We've seen a British actor say he doesn't feel like he's sick, and he's confirmed positive. When do you start testing people that aren't showing symptoms?
So at the moment it's very clear, and we're in line with the WHO advice on this, to use both the epidemiological criteria. So there has to be a reason why their symptoms might be related to COVID-19, because remembering that most of the symptoms we're talking about will still in New Zealand be a result of common cold or potentially influenza. So there has to be that history of travel or contact with a possible case and the symptoms. Now, previously the symptoms required fever and cough or shortness of breath. That's been brought in to be fever and or cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, not feeling that well, with or without fever. So we have brought in the clinical criteria as well.
The people in Wellington, are they New Zealand citizens? Can you tell us more about their age and gender?
So there are 2 men. I think I went over this. If I'll just quickly pop back to my notes. 2 men, yes. One in his 30s and father in his 70s. And again, the younger one became unwell on the flight, and the father actually after he had returned about a day later.
What can we cope with, and how will today's money change that?
Well, our system is is gearing up to cope with if we do get a wider outbreak in New Zealand. However, our response is also very focused, of course, on flattening the peak of what the size of that outbreak might be so that it is at a level where the health system can cope. One of the areas I know there's a lot of interest in is around ICU capacity, intensive care unit capacity, and the ability to ventilate people who are very unwell. Now, in addition to our ICU beds, there are a number of other places in the hospital where people can be ventilated, for example, in the post-operative room when they've come out of theatre. So one of the ways we can surge capacity to ventilate people is to stop surgery, elective surgery. We would keep doing acute surgery and use those places and those machines to ventilate people who may be critically unwell. One of the key focuses, first of all, is to train additional staff in looking after people who require ventilation, partly to ensure that if we have ICU staff off sick, we can make sure we are maximising in all our ICU beds, but also so those people can look after people who might be being ventilated in those other areas of the hospital.
What can you tell us about there's a woman in Dunedin that we believe is being or is going to be deported for not having self-isolation plans? What can you tell us about that?
I'm not sure if...
Not Dunedin, Christchurch.
Yeah, in Christchurch, yes. So there was a traveller who came in yesterday after the new expectations and requirements went into effect, who was unwilling to commit to self-isolating for the 2-week period and said that her intention was to continue with her travels. That person has been found and still appears to be unwilling, so the intention is therefore to deport that person.
How many other similar cases?
That's the only one I know about. There is the odd person who's come through and perhaps expressed a view they weren't going to self-isolate, and they've been spoken to and convinced that it is the right thing to do. We are also starting from today the spot checks on people who are self-isolating, just to help reassure us and of course other New Zealanders that people are doing the right thing.
How did she come to attention?
How did she come to attention?
Yeah.
Because she's now we have health staff at the border before the immigration and customs desks, and they are looking at the health declaration of every person coming in and quizzing them about their plans for self-isolation. And if they are not convinced that the person has concrete plans, or if the person is objecting to self-isolation, then they can refer those people. We have either police staff or customs officials there who can make a decision about whether that person gets let into the country in the first place.
What is your advice for people who are made aware of travellers who aren't going to self-isolate? What can those people do in that situation?
Well, I think one of the things they can do is, if it's at the airport, they can make customs officials or the health staff aware of that. And again, usually people, after a discussion about why the requirement is there and what the expectations are willing to comply. And of course we can support that with our spot check activities. Or if it's someone who has arrived back and other members and other people in the community are aware that the person's not self-isolating, in other words, physical distancing, for example, they're going to work or going out to a restaurant, then they could either let the health line know, and that can be followed up, or they could let the police know.
What would you say to
people have entered the country since the deadline? Do you have the figures for that?
I'm sorry I don't, but we'll get those figures. I do know that the number of people coming into the country, and you will have seen reports of this, has dropped significantly, and of course this is having a real effect on all the airlines coming in.
And if you're also able to find out like how many of those are New Zealanders returning home and how many of those are foreigners, and do you know where they are, and have they had to have help to self-isolate or something else? That would be quite interesting to give those figures.
Okay, we'll get some information about that, yes.
What would you say to the tourist that wasn't willing to self-isolate?
I can understand why someone who might have planned a trip for a long time, for 2 weeks to New Zealand, might be disappointed to arrive and find right at the 11th hour that they can't travel around the country. However, we are not the only country that is putting these expectations in place, and there is a very good reason to do so, and that is to protect the health and well-being of New Zealanders.
Obviously, one school has been affected already with this Dunedin case, and public health experts that we've spoken to are saying that schools and universities need to close now. Why hasn't that been done already?
Well, certainly closing educational institutions, whether they're early childhood centres, schools or universities or other tertiary institutions, is an option, and it's one of the suite of options we've got. In fact, the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor just today asked her team to have a look at what other countries have done, and there's a mixed approach here, but actually if you look at countries that have been successful to date in keeping the number of cases low, like Taiwan and Singapore, for example, they haven't closed schools or educational institutions, and our approach at the moment is to, if we need to, we can pivot to do that, but at the moment we don't have community transmission and we don't think that's a necessary step.
But surely that would be an essential part of stopping community transmission, is closing schools and universities.
Yes, it may well be, if that time comes. All our cases so far have come from overseas travel, and likewise it may well be you don't need to close all of those institutions around the country. You may just need to do it in a location or a region.
Will we see
Sorry, just here.
GPs are not able to give out flu vaccinations yet, or flu jabs, sorry. Why aren't they able to do that yet?
Yes.
And what are the normal restrictions on that? Why shouldn't we be giving people the best protection they can against influenza?
Yes, so actually the flu vaccination campaign we have brought forward. It usually starts at the beginning of April, and so vaccine is now going out to general practices, and there'll be an announcement about the nature of the campaign tomorrow. But all I can say is it's very important this year that we vaccinate as many of our vulnerable people against influenza, because they are the ones who are most likely to end up in hospital and put pressure on the system. So these are the people for whom flu vaccine is publicly funded, over 65s and people under 65s with pre-existing conditions. They are the same people who are at risk of more serious infections from COVID-19. So actually we're bringing forward the campaign, but we are also asking that people who are not in those groups defer getting their vaccination for a few weeks, so we can make sure we are using all our capacity to vaccinate those most vulnerable. And I think many New Zealanders will understand that's the right thing to do.
The man who developed symptoms on the flight, which flight was that he developed the symptoms on? The one into New Zealand? Or
Yes, on the international flight while he was travelling back from the USA.
And were Ministry of Health officials in the airport made aware that he was experiencing symptoms when he landed in Auckland?
I'm not sure, but what we have routinely done is look at the journey of our cases through the airport, in particular to check that no airport staff were in interaction with someone for more than that 15-minute period, to make sure they're not a close contact. We'll be doing the same, and of course we look and just see and make sure that the right health information was given or the right interaction happened.
Were any of the symptoms he was experiencing at that time a fever?
No, I don't have that information, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Will we see confirmed COVID-19 cases spike now doctors have been directed to do more testing?
So yeah, I think what we want to do is find cases out there, and we, at this stage, as we've found with the 3 we're talking about today, we will find more cases. We want to find those cases. What we are trying to do is find the cases, minimise further transmission. What I would say is that with the new border restrictions in place and less people coming in from overseas, if we can get on top of those individual sporadic cases and isolate close contacts, we can successfully prevent onward transmission to avoid the big spike that we've seen in other countries.
Some of the events are, they're limited to 500. Some people are setting up events at 450 tickets. What's your thoughts on that? Is that a bit cheeky? Is that really pushing the boat out on what is acceptable in times where we should be taking precautions?
So we've got further advice coming around mass events, and that will be available in the next day or two. What I would say also, I think people will understand what the purpose of the 500 number is. It's not a bright line. It's to ensure that people are doing the right thing, and I'm not sure that organisers would be taking the approach, well, if I organise 450, I don't need to worry about it. It's their responsibility, not just to protect the people attending the event, but actually to contribute to a wider response, and I'm sure they'll take that seriously. Sorry?
Is enough testing being taken place?
Yes, well, what we've seen over this last week or so is an increase, a ramping up of the testing, and over the last few days it's been somewhere around 100 or just over 100, and we've seen today, I think, around 500 tests being processed around the country.
Just to be really clear, where are you testing that you weren't already testing?
In terms of which laboratory is doing the testing?
No, what people are you testing that you weren't testing
So what we've seen is people with symptoms, and because that case, our areas of concern has now brought in to be basically travel from anywhere, then that is the major contributor to the increase in testing, and also because the symptom cluster can be fever or the respiratory symptoms with or without fever.
The next
Sorry,
ones
one
are
more,
saying
Dr.
that
Method.
we should be doing 1,000 or more tests a day.
Yes.
Is that number feasible? Can we do that in the next couple of days?
We have the capacity to do up to 1,500 tests a day. Well, actually, we can do between 750 and 1,000 if we need to. To go from 750 to 1,000, that just means doing an extra shift of the laboratory staff. Again, we don't want to run our laboratory staff into the ground. So what's most important is that we test the right people and we rapidly identify the positives that test there, and then we act accordingly. One more question over here.
A case has been raised with us where an employer required that someone undergo a test for COVID-19, but because they didn't meet the strict case definition, they were then unable to get it, so they were left in between a rock and a hard place. What is your advice in that situation? What does someone in that situation do?
So in that situation, I would imagine the employer needs to be really clear about why we are testing just symptomatic people and people who fit the case definition, and that is because the testing is there for our overall COVID response, not to just meet the needs of an individual employer or an individual. So I think most employers will be, and others will be, aware of why it is we test the people who we think might have COVID-19 to rule it in or out. And I imagine that employers will be very understanding and supportive of that. I know there are lots more questions, but please, I do have other commitments, and I just want to thank you very much. And we will see you at the next media update. Thanks again.